confirming once more with our technicians that everything is halal, kosher, and otherwise ready to go. Great. Welcome, one and all, to the opening of our conference, Post-Colonial, Post-Imperial, Decolonial, De-Imperial. I'm Jeremy Walton. I've been in correspondence with most of you. My apologies to those of you whom I have yet to be able to greet in person. I trust that we'll have ample opportunity for conversation and celebration, and even perhaps criticism in the days to come. I will be relatively brief now so that we have enough time for my somewhat longer than planned opening remarks, but I do want to just dispense with, for the first time, not dispense with, but rather emphasize the gratitude and immense, limitless thanks I have for all of those who've contributed to the coming together. Of course, all of you for coming to Rijeka and for contributing your perspectives to this gathering. But some more specific people, all of the members of our REVENANT research group, REVENANT, Revivals of Empire, Nostalgia, Amnesia, Tribulation, have been wonderful supports. I can't thank each of you enough, so you'll meet them over the coming days. But Mateja Magdic, Adi Tufek, Slaven, Crnic, sorry Slaven, I was losing your last name there, Ivan Flis, Kevin Kenjar, Magdalena Mejacic, and who am I forgetting here? Goran Stanic, excuse me. Goran is looking at me very, I know, I'm getting to Emma, don't worry, we're getting to Emma. Also to the technicians who are joining us here this morning who've been a wonderful help, Marco and Victor and all of their support group, the caterers and so forth. We'll thank all of them again in the closing. But above all, and I think she needs no introduction at this point, Emanuela Erasmus, who is really a genius of administration and coordination. So please do thank her specifically, because without her, this wouldn't have happened at all, and indeed our group itself would not have happened at all. So with that, I'll just introduce our guests. Our guests to two of our supports from the administration here at the faculty and the university. First, I'd like to welcome the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, Alexander Mijatovic.
To address you less formally before my formal opening remark, everything looks great, wonderful. I think it will be a splendid conference. And now to address you in a more formal way, dear colleagues, dear Jeremy, dear REVENANT team, dear attendants of the International Conference Post-Colonial, Decolonial, Post-Imperial, De-Imperial, it is my pleasure and honor to welcome you at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences of Rijeka. Thank you very much for gathering on this venue institution to deliver and convey the engaging and intricate topic of the conference. You are assembled here to discuss and interchange ideas and perspectives on the entanglement and complicity between colonialism and imperialism. Indeed, you will tend to grasp intersections between the simultaneous and yet disparate processes of decolonization and de-imperialization to expound the complex transformation and transition toward decolonial and de-imperial. The state of theory in the past decades is epitomized in the prefix post, such as postmodernism, postcolonialism, post-memory, and so on. However, your conference introduces important shift from the prefix post to the prefix de, in Latin de. Prefix post indicates succession coming afterward. On the contrary, the prefix de means that something will disappear or it is about to disappear. Yet disappearance has its own materiality, practices and residual after effects on new reality. Thank you, Jeremy. and your great REVENANT team for deciding to become a part of our Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences community, and for organizing this wonderful conference with an appealing and challenging thesis. I consider that conceptual achievements of the conference will be far-reaching and trailblazing. I'd like to thank to all participants for attending the conference, to convey their thoughts and foster academic network in Rijeka and Croatia. I wish you all a fruitful conference and, not less important, enjoyable stay here in Rijeka. Thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you so much, Alexander. You've already given us some food for thought and debate, I think. I'd now like to welcome as our second introductory address, Gordan Jelenic, the Vice Chancellor of the University. Gordan.
Dear guests, dear participants to the conference, Post-Colonial, Decolonial, Post-Imperial, the Imperial, I'm very glad to be able to address you here in the name of our rector, Professor Snevana P. Samarvia, who unfortunately is not able to be here with you today. At the university, we are immensely proud to be able to host this conference as a result of a very important ERC project led by our colleague, Jeremy. This is a really splendid occasion for us all here, and I'm really immensely happy to be here and to address all these illustrious people who are researchers in this important field. I have not prepared anything specifically to address you today, but I just had a brief look at the snippets of REVENANT at the ERC page, and from there I would just like to draw some particular parts. Okay, so the questions that are being opened in the project is how and why the historical figures become key to our memories of the past. How do specific places become sites of post-imperial memory? And how are former empires personified through objects and material culture? It is obvious that in recent years, the bygone empires have refused to remain confined to the past. And we see it today more than at any time, I would say, even during the making of this proposal today. Across the globe, a certain imperial fascination has caused post-imperial legacies to become the objects of collective memory, nostalgia, aspiration, and criticism. In this particular project, all these questions are addressed interdisciplinarily, drawing from different fields, including anthropology, sociology, history, and comparative literature. This city here will be also the site of the, will be one of the sites where the research will actually be conducted. And as you, I'm sure, know, it itself draws on its own imperial history, primarily Habsburg history, but it also has some other traces of the old empires here, which are not specifically covered in the project of REVENANT. However, the REVENANT also says that from the comparative perspective, it is important that the research is conducted regarding those bygone imperial projects as inseparable from contemporary political and cultural lives. It will extend its research also on the areas of Eastern Europe, the Balkans, the Caucasus, and the Middle East, which we see today are really the places where crises of possibly immense proportions are unfolding right now. And to that extent, the timing is indeed perfect for such a project to take place here. And I'm sure that during the panels that are also part of the conference here, not only the project results, but also the contemporary and the current issues unfolding before us will be also discussed. Thank you very much for being present today. Wish you a successful work and wish you a pleasant stay in our city, at our university as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gordan. It's always a special privilege when others do one's work for one. He's so kindly introduced the project that I think I can now forego with that. I'm going to have to move over to the computer here to deliver my own more capacious opening remarks. So I'll do that in a moment, but I just want to re-emphasize, because Gordan was here on behalf of the Chancellor, the Rektorica, Snezhina Prijic-Samardzija, who can't be here with us, but she has also been an immense support, as has Alexander, of course, at the faculty. So especially wanting to acknowledge both of them. And just before I move slightly to my left to begin my remarks, which hopefully are over there because I don't have them in my head at the moment, I'd like to say that it is really a sort of, as you'll see, I'm going to talk about uncanniness a little bit this morning, and it is an uncanny privilege to be standing before all of you and to see familiar faces, dear friends whom I've known for decades even, and at the same time new friends and colleagues whom I've only met this morning, but whom I already feel I know from our correspondence. So thank you again for joining us, and with that I will introduce myself, I guess, and move over here. It's a bit of an awkward ballet or choreography, but I think it will work. And after I'm done this morning, a few points of, sorry, I should make a few points of order as well, since I am occupying the podium. First, unfortunately, due to a health, not an emergency, but a health situation, one of the panelists on one of the first panels this morning will have to be switched about. That'll be announced in the panel, but we think she's doing well. And secondly, our keynote, I should also thank our keynote speakers, of course. That was something that I neglected to do. We have with us, of course, two wonderful keynote speakers, Madina Tlostanova, who will be speaking later this morning, and Maria Todorova, who will be speaking on Friday, and we welcome them especially to the university and to Rijeka. Priyambada Gopal, unfortunately, also due to a health issue, is unable to travel, but we will be streaming her keynote tomorrow in the hope that all will go well with that. And on that note, I will now move over to my left. Hello. That was rather awkward. A long journey to the left. That might be the subtitle of my autobiography one day. So I had not initially intended to write a sort of a keynote of my own, but yet somehow, and this is not a keynote, I should say, because we have wonderful keynotes ahead of us, but somehow I couldn't avoid writing more than I had expected. So I hope you'll bear with me, and coffee will be coming your way soon after this is over. So thanks to Gordan in particular for already introducing some of the purview and themes and commitments of our research group. We'll have many more conversations about that. You are all in the presence of REVENANT, as it were, and REVENANT is happy to be in the presence of you. But for the moment, I'm going to deliver some, if I can, I guess I have to open the PowerPoint. A few notes on, in a sort of disjointed fashion that I think will serve to orient, well, have served to orient myself to some of the themes that we're pursuing, and hopefully will also serve to orient you. Post-colonial, decolonial, post-imperial, de-imperial. A quartet of adjectives masquerading as nouns. How do they address us and interpolate us? How might they reorient us to our research and to the myriad contexts that we inhabit? How might we make our way through the political and conceptual thicket that they demarcate? What do they share, and what boundaries might separate them? Finally, what resources do they offer in the efforts to forge collective futures that overcome the violent cleavages of the present? To offer preemptive answers to these questions would be rash at this point. Their pursuit, after all, draws us together here in Rijeka. Moreover, I'm certain that many of you will succeed in interrogating these concepts and categories much more effectively than I am able to do. Rather than discursive closure, I offer these remarks as a literal and metaphorical opening for the conference, one that seeks new horizons and widens unexpected apertures. To begin, I reflect on the distinct stakes of analytic and interpretive approaches to post-colonies and post-empires, inspired in particular by Dipesh Chakrabarty, Achille Mbembe, and Sigmund Freud, among others. In particular, I emphasize the characteristic historicity of the post-empire, as I call it, marked by a dichotomy of nostalgia and abnegation, in order to clear the ground for a more precise model of what we might think of as de-imperial critique. Secondly, I consider two sites that, in high anthropological fashion, are good to think with, drawing on my own research, of course, in relation to post-colonial, decolonial, post-imperial, and de-imperial logics and imperatives. Finally, as a coda, I turn to the age of war and political violence that we now inhabit in order to suggest a rejuvenated critique of violence in the post-colony and the post-empire. So if that's not enough, well, then I don't know what is, but we'll see how it goes. So first, near the beginning of provincializing Europe, this is always tricky, there we go. Near the beginning of provincializing Europe, Dipesh Chakrabarty takes a methodological detour in order to organize the arguments to come. He does so by means of a provocative distinction between analysis and interpretation. And you see the quote here, I'll read it at length. This book necessarily turns around a fault line central to modern European thought. This is the divide between analytic and hermeneutic traditions in the social sciences. Broadly speaking, one may explain the division thus. Analytic social science fundamentally attempts to demystify ideology in order to produce a critique that looks toward a more just social order. I take Marx to be a classic exemplar of this tradition. Hermeneutic tradition, on the other hand, produces a loving grasp of detail in search of an understanding of the diversity of life worlds. It produces what may be called affective histories. The first tradition tends to evacuate the local by assimilating it to some abstract universal. The hermeneutic tradition, on the other hand, finds thought intimately tied to places and particular forms of life. It is innately critical of the nihilism of that which is purely analytic. Heidegger is my icon for the second tradition. Now, there's perhaps something to be said here about the potential irony of Chakrabarty invoking Marx and Heidegger in a project of provincializing Europe, but rather than sort of view this cynically, I tend to think of this more as an attempt to foster an immanent critique within the contradictions of what he calls the European tradition of social thought generally, but that's just a footnote. So rather than Marx and Heidegger, Foucault and Benjamin are the avatars of the analytic and hermeneutic traditions that situate my perspective, but that's largely another story for another day, hopefully. I invoke Chakrabarty here because of the distinction between the analytic and the interpretive, I think, captures the double spirit of our conference and the quartet of concepts that orient it. The analytic tradition inspires precision, contrast, and comparison as key principles of inquiry into the post-colonial, the decolonial, the post-imperial, and the de-imperial. Above all, the imperative of analysis demands attention to the distinctions and relations between the colonial and the imperial. Is this a relationship of part to whole, in which the latter encompasses the former? In other words, are colonial polities one species of a broader genus, that of empire? Alternatively, is there a definitive contrast between colonial and imperial formations, and therefore their legacies and aftermaths as well? What are the consequences for political action if we advocate a synonymous or conversely a contrasting definition of the colonial and the imperial? Such an analytic approach also entails attention to the separate genealogies of post-colonial and decolonial critique, the first emerging from the subaltern studies group orbiting Calcutta, and therefore especially attuned to the legacies of the British Empire in South Asia, the second taking shape among South American sociologists and scholars of comparative literature, and consequently oriented toward the longue durée of empires and the Iberian empires, especially in the Americas. We might also add a few other terms to this constellation which are not in the title, the anti-colonial and the anti-imperial, which have animated the work of one of our keynotes, Priyambada Gopal especially. Finally, the addition of a new term, the de-imperial, to this crowded conceptual field demands analytic exactitude in order to avoid the all too common pitfall of recorking old conceptual wine in new terminological wineskins. One of my ulterior motives in organizing this conference is to wrestle with this dilemma, the capacity of this new term, the de-imperial, and I feel immensely fortunate to have recruited all of you to help me to do so. While the analytic tradition parses, distinguishes, and classifies, and again, think about the Chakrabarti quote, the hermeneutic tradition champions the virtues of synthesis, dialogism, and context. In my previous work, I've summarized this approach by way of the notion of textured historicity, for those of you who might have looked into it. The interpretive stance to specific sites, actors, and narratives insists that our guiding terms, post-colonial, decolonial, post-imperial, de-imperial, should not be treated as positivist categories. On the contrary, distinct concepts both illuminate and obscure features of specific contexts in a differential fashion, and conversely, the context one examines fuel conceptual tailoring, recalibration, and transgression. To put this another way, post-coloniality, decoloniality, post-imperiality, and de-imperiality are not objective, settled features of persons, places, and things awaiting discovery or unearthing. They are politicized mediations that bear consequences for action and thought in the present and the future. So analysis and interpretation are thus axes upon which we might plot the presentations of our conference yet to come. Hopefully, these two terms will also take shape as a dialectic that reconfigures our understanding of the post-colonial, the decolonial, the post-imperial, and the de-imperial. In such a dialectical fashion, analytic and hermeneutic approaches complement and supplement each other, as Chakrabarti rightly suggests. They are not meant as mutually exclusive opponents, but to the contrary, they are mutually entailing. Whether parsed analytically or unfurled hermeneutically, post-colonial, decolonial, post-imperial, and de-imperial inquiries grapple with knotted temporal dilemmas. Achille Mbembe, for one, has interrogated the temporal scandal of the post-colony, which, as he quotes, encloses multiple durées made up of discontinuities, reversals, inertias, and swings that overlay one another, interpenetrate one another, and envelope one another, an entanglement, end quote. Recently, I've advocated a conceptual sibling to the post-colony, the notion of the post-empire. Now, without denying the salience of temporal entanglements in post-imperial contexts, the concept of the post-empire emphasizes a distinct constellation of temporality and historicity, one that revolves around nostalgia, abnegation, and uncanniness. While nostalgia and abnegation form an antithetical pair of historical visions in the post-empire. While nostalgia sanitizes the imperial past in order to render it amenable to contemporary sensibilities and projects, abnegation attempts to create a cordon sanitaire between contemporary socio-political life, typically imagined as national, and disavowed imperial legacies. However, neither nostalgia nor abnegation exhausts the historicity of the post-empire, because neither succeeds in overcoming post-imperial uncanniness, understood in the Freudian sense of the unheimlich, the unhomely. Post-imperial uncanniness, what Freud calls, quote, that species of the frightening that goes back to what was once well known and had long been familiar, haunts and saturates the post-empire. So this understanding of post-empire and its characteristic uncanniness clarifies and sharpens the fourth term that we have introduced with the title of our conference, the de-imperial. Clearly, decolonial critique now suffers from overuse and carries innumerable meanings across multiple contexts. To return momentarily to the roots of decoloniality in the work of Quijano and Mignolo, my sense is that the principal aim of decolonial critique is first to expose the persistence of what Quijano calls the coloniality of power in modern times, and secondly, to establish lines of flight away from this pervasive structure of power by fostering and amplifying forms of radical alterity that evade it. Of course, others here, especially our keynote, Madina Tolstanova, will be able to address this question more effectively than I can. If we take this as a minimum description of decolonial critique, we can more effectively grasp the distinction of the de-imperial. De-imperial critique does not wield a romance of radical alterity. Rather, it seeks to inhabit and accentuate the uncanniness that saturates post-imperial space and post-imperial place. Indeed, uncanniness is both a means and an end for de-imperial critique, a means to destabilizing the settlements of the imperial past in the present, and accordingly an unsettling, unsettled end in and of itself. Uncanniness unravels the dichotomy of familiar and unknown by historicizing and integrating both. That which was once familiar is now difficult to know, and that which was once unknown is strangely recognizable. De-imperial critique operates similarly in order to render the uncanny textures of the imperial past as it exists over time, both in the present and at unlimited junctures in the future. So now I'd like to move relatively briefly to two examples that I hope will illustrate what I have in mind. I don't have a timepiece with me other than the one that's on our logo, which doesn't work. So if I'm really going over time, someone will have to let me know. Welcome to Zemun. Some of you have been there. Zemun, a district of Belgrade northwest of the confluence of the Sava and Danube rivers, is fully incorporated into the metropolis today, but its history is a chronicle of imperial peripheries and divisions. Zemun's most iconic landmark perches on a hill overlooking the Danube to the north and the large municipal cemetery to the south. Gardosh Tower, also known as the Tower of János Hunyadi, and we won't get into the interesting, that could be a lecture in its own right, the sort of memory cultures surrounding János Hunyadi, Janka in Serbia. I'm going to get this all wrong. I'll just leave the translation to others. Gardosh Tower, also known as the Tower of János Hunyadi. While this parapet forms an unavoidable aspect of Zemun's skyline, it is a historical and political orphan. When it was erected in 1896, it was one of the Hungarian kingdom's plethora of millennial towers, which commemorated 1,000 years of Hungarian sovereignty in Central Europe and marked the geographic extent of the Hungarian Empire. At the time, Zemun was a borderland Habsburg city in the Hungarian half of the dual monarchy, and the Gardosh Tower expressed the august history and spatial ambitions of Hungarian Empire. The tower is awkwardly situated in today's Serbia, however, a prominent post-imperial site that is poorly suited to the nation-state's concerns. Gardosh is not the only Millennium Tower still standing today. Others are scattered across erstwhile Transleithania, the Habsburg lands of the Crown of St. Stephen, in Hungary as well as in Ukraine. Towers once stood in Romania and Slovakia, but are no more. Of course, they weren't Romania and Slovakia at the time. What might a de-imperial critique of the millennial towers today entail? As I noted above, collective memory in the post-empire skews toward polarization. Imperial pasts are reduced to objects of either nostalgic glorification or condemnation. The Millennium Towers have followed both of these trajectories. In Hungary, they are welcome reminders of a triumphant imperial legacy prior to the humiliating geographic curtailment of the Treaty of Trianon in 1920. Conversely, in Slovakia and Transylvania and Romania, the towers have fallen victim to damnatio memoriae, an erasure from the historical record and material environment. The fact that Zemun's Gardosh Tower has avoided these antithetical fates suggests a third trajectory for post-imperial heritage: irrelevance, indifference, and ad hoc reappropriation. And this is, in fact, the state of Gardosh today. Its bottom floor hosts an art gallery, while the top of the tower is open to tourists seeking panoramic views of the Danube and Belgrade. It also hosts a permanent exhibition of famous Serbian scientists, including Nikola Tesla, which bears no clear relation to the site itself. A de-imperial perspective on Gardosh and the Millennium Towers generally insists on moving beyond what Svetlana Boym calls restorative nostalgia, damnatio memoria, and haphazard transformation alike. Such a critique dwells in the uncanniness of the towers, the relationship between the imperial ambitions that led to their erection and the post-imperial folly of treating those ambitions as either simply ongoing or simply irrelevant. At Gardner specifically, such post-imperial uncanniness for me emerges most dramatically through the palimpsest of graffiti that forms a hieroglyphic-like pattern on the bricks of its upper reaches. Testimony to the plethora of pilgrims who have sought out the area of the tower over time. I'm not going to go into these two particular images, though I think they are quite fascinating in their own right, particularly the burger from Zagreb. These biographical traces are both irreducible to and inseparable from the politics of empires and post-empires. To the visitor today, they offer a heterotopic mirror that is simultaneously familiar and strange, both homely and alien. So now to the second site, which I visited just over a week ago, so it's very much at the forefront of my mind. We're now traveling to just the opposite side of the Bosphorus in Istanbul. A new monument resembling a latticework cage in marble now occupies pride of place near the Eastern Asian terminus of the southernmost bridge over the Bosphorus in Istanbul. Some of you may have been there. Some of you certainly have been in Istanbul, I know. The memorial to the martyrs of July 15th, which one of the sort of subplots here is that its term is not memorial anıt in Turkish, but rather makam, which summons a whole distinct set of associations, arguably more rooted in Muslim piety, but that's something I won't go into. The memorial to the martyrs of July 15th and its accompanying museum, the Memory July 15th Museum, Hafiza 15 Temmuz Müzesi, are the most comprehensive and authoritative commemoration of the failed putsch against the Turkish government that occurred on 15 July 2016. The failed coup attempt against President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his Justice and Development Party was spearheaded by a group of putschists in the Turkish military and resulted in the deaths of 248 people. Almost immediately, blame and responsibility were attributed to the expatriate Turkish theologian Fethullah Gülen and his global network of followers. This is a huge topic that I'm not going to go into at all, but we can talk about it later if it is of interest to any of you, since it is one of my ongoing research topics. As elsewhere in recent times, the political labor of collective memory began almost immediately after the coup attempt had been thwarted. The monument was inaugurated with fanfare exactly 1 year following the coup attempt, while the museum followed 2 years later in 2019. The ambition of the monument and the museum extend far beyond memorialization of the martyrs to the coup, şehitler in Turkish. In particular, the bottom floor of the museum, excuse me, I've lost my place. The bottom floor of the museum, to which the visitors descend following a lurid pedagogical recounting of the events of the night of 15th and 16th July 2016, casts a wide political and ideological net. A sophisticated exhibition contextualizes the coup attempt within a broader history of colonialism and imperialism, sömürgecilik, imperialism, including inter alia the genocidal destruction of Native Americans, the North Atlantic slave trade, imperial designs in the Middle East, Islamophobia, and an exhaustive catalog of 20th and 21st century coups d'etat orchestrated by imperialist powers. One especially upsetting display features a life-size statue of an African slave bound by chains attached to a ring around his neck and kneeling in front of a video screen that plays a brief video titled A History of Colonialism on repeat. I have opted not to include that image because I think it's potentially upsetting, and indeed it's upset me when I encountered it in the museum. Another section of the exhibition, and you see this here on the left side of the slide, consists of a wall of heroes commemorating those who have resisted exploitation and injustice. The heroes make for a fascinatingly disparate group, so as you can see, you have Simon Bolivar, Ottoman Sultan Abdulhamid II, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. The pairing of those two in particular is interesting. Omar al-Mukhtar, leading the Libyan resistance against Italian colonialism in North Africa, Gandhi, Che Guevara, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Alija Izetbegovic for the local flavor in the Balkans, and Nelson Mandela. So there's obviously a lot more to say about this museum, and it's become a sort of idée fixe for me in the last, well, since I first visited last year. I'm going to have to leave that behind and just in the context of the conference make a few points that I think are apposite. First of all, or above all rather, the Memory 15 July Museum epitomizes a new challenge for decolonial critique. How does one decolonize a space that claims the moral and political authority of decoloniality itself? This is tricky terrain, but the perspective of de-imperiality as I have introduced it here can help, I think. As I've already emphasized, de-imperial critique rejects the dichotomous Manichaean historicity that saturates the post-empire. Seen in this light, the Memory 15 July Museum is a dramatically post-imperial space. Turkey as a nation-state remains an ambivalent heir to the Ottoman Empire, but neo-Ottoman nostalgia has recently become a privileged idiom for both Turkish politics and public culture. This sanitized romance of the Ottoman past, which I've written a lot about, I should say, so another topic that you're welcome to quiz me on later, has recently become, this sanitized romance of the Ottoman past finds a dark counterpoint as well, in the Memory 15 July Museum, a paranoid dystopia of most every other imperial past, nestled in the empowering discourse of decoloniality. I continue to struggle with how to articulate my discomfort with the Memory 15 July Museum. It's awkward in English, obviously. Yet I sense that this route promises some clarity. De-imperial critique insists that decoloniality cannot be summoned to support the dualistic politics from which the post-empire harnesses legitimacy and authority. Moreover, de-imperial critique seizes directly on the uncanniness of witnessing decolonial language summoned to such nationalist and simplistically ideological designs. Okay, how am I doing on time? 10 minutes, I think that's perfect. Thank you, Ivan. So now, by way of a conclusion, which really could have been the entire lecture in the first place. We've been inundated in recent months by, and this is by way, in some sense, also, I should say, of addressing an elephant in the room that needs to be taken seriously. We've been inundated in recent months by horrific images and tales of war in Gaza and Ukraine. By contrast, the relative absence of images and reports of warfare in Sudan and Myanmar, not to mention elsewhere, gesture to more subtle practice of violence, that of selective silencing and disregard. While composing these remarks and anticipating our time together, I've attempted to think through the political geography of war and violence today in relation to our conference's guiding themes. What does a decolonial or a de-imperial critique entail vis-a-vis war today? What can such a critique achieve in relation to the economies of information and attention that determine how, where, and when political violence is successfully or unsuccessfully mediated? There are no simple answers to these questions, but they demand an airing. So several points are immediately relevant, I think. First, the discussion of war and political violence implies and complicates the relationship between scholarship and activism. This is a topic that we've been discussing here at the faculty. I don't know if Sarah Cherney is in the room, but she's initiated a series of lectures having to do in particular with the threat to academics in Germany. Hajj, the professor of anthropology in Halle, in particular, who was removed from his job, inspired this. And of course, Sanja Bojanic has also participated in it. But it's a topic that's been on our minds. So, to return to my prepared text. Yes, the discussion of war and political violence implies and complicates the relationship between scholarship and activism. Activism demands statements of certitude and agonistic positionalities that scholarship can often trouble. Yet simultaneously, scholarship can and must inform activist sensibilities. I continue to believe that activist speech and scholarly speech are distinct, But I also recognize that many, including many of you perhaps, reject this distinction. As an activist, I condemn the war in Gaza and the ongoing cynical forms of settler colonialism on the part of Israel that make Palestinian public life a near impossibility. As an activist, I decry Putin's warmongering and his irredentist ambitions in Ukraine and other post-Soviet contexts. As an activist, I bemoan the myopia of the global north that makes war in Sudan, Myanmar, and elsewhere an afterthought. These sentiments also inform me as a scholar, but I do not feel that they are sufficient as scholarship. In a more scholarly vein, then, the knotted multiple imperial pasts that inhabit both Ukraine and Israel-Palestine are inescapable and warrant more precise attention. Indeed, both of these contexts involve the post-empires that specifically animate our REVENANT group. The war in Ukraine has galvanized Romanov's Soviet and even Habsburg legacies, both on the part of Putin's monstrous neo-imperial historicism and in relation to Ukrainian self-understandings. The intractable dilemmas of Israel-Palestine are frequently boiled down to British imperial mismanagement. Balfour, of course, is the placeholder here. But both centuries of Ottoman rule and contemporary American imperialism are clearly at play as well. Accordingly, the critique of violence in both contexts must also be de-imperial. More abstractly, Chakrabarty's pairing of analytic and hermeneutic methods with which I began this lecture has the potential to inform a capacious critique of violence. Two texts in particular come to mind, and you see them here. So, from the analytic vantage, Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth remains chillingly pertinent. Fanon's arguments have been the topic of much debate recently, especially in relation to Israel-Palestine and the devastation in Gaza. Fanon insists that the violence of warfare should not be essentialized or sequestered from broader structures of violence. Colonial society and colonial political life are saturated by and based on violence. Therefore, as he famously writes, quote, "It is the intuition of the colonized masses that their liberation must and can only be achieved by force." With Fanon, then, we must insist on a critique of violence as a social, political, and cultural structure rather than as an essentialized type of event. Violent acts are symptomatic of violent structures, patterns, and processes. On the other hand, Walter Benjamin's critique of violence offers powerful hermeneutic resources for interpreting the relationship between structures of oppression and political violence. Benjamin insists that violence cannot be adequately judged on the basis of the ends it serves. Quote, "If violence is a means, a criterion for criticizing it might seem immediately available. It imposes itself in the question of whether violence in a given case is a means to a just or an unjust end. A critique of it would then be implied in a system of just ends. This, however, is not so, for what such a system, assuming it to be secure against all doubt, would contain is not a criterion for violence itself as a principle, but rather the criterion for cases of its use. The question would remain open whether violence as a principle could be a moral means even to just ends. This open question is as urgent, perhaps even more urgent today than it was in the aftermath of the Great War. Benjamin cautions against simple celebration of the violence of resistance against structural violence of imperialism and colonialism. Many on the left have saluted Hamas's attack on Israel on the 7th of October because they evaluated it as a means to a just end, decolonization. In a comparable way, Ukrainian resistance to Putin's ugly ambitions has been feted despite its frequent invocations of essentialist nationalism, a political discourse that many supporters of Ukraine would otherwise denounce. Benjamin, I hope, helps us to escape such morally dubious and politically naive positions because he maintains that the justice and desirability of some of the ends of violence does not necessarily justify violence as such. By reading Fanon and Benjamin with and against each other, we can open a space for both supporting Ukraine and criticizing nationalistic militarism, for both insisting on Palestinian liberation and condemning Hamas's military strategy and tactics. Or so I hope. War and political violence, and I'm now coming to the end, are by no means simply matters of the post-colony and the post-empire, of course. Yet, simultaneously, even banal post-colonial and post-imperial contexts are saturated by overt and subtle formations of violence. Whether post-colonial, post-imperial, or otherwise, political violence is almost always, by definition, uncanny. It renders familiar persons, places, and things unrecognizable. The uncanniness of political violence is not somewhere anyone should have to dwell, yet it is increasingly a mandatory home for many. My final hope for today, and for our conference and beyond, is that our collective effort to comprehend the uncanniness of former colonial and imperial contexts might yield strategies for thinking and acting against and beyond the uncanny violence of the present. Thank you. So I'm unaware of what time it is, but we have 5 minutes, so I would be delighted to hear from any of you if any of you would like to hear more from me. Or is that too rich a breakfast? Yes, please. About the, that might be, I think I heard it, but so the Memory 15 July Museum, is that correct? This could go on and on, but briefly, I'll assume at least some familiarity with the events of 2016, in which a group within the Turkish military attempted to overthrow the government of the Justice and Development Party and the Recep Tayyip Erdogan. They were thwarted. There was massive violence in Ankara and Istanbul and elsewhere that night. It's become arguably the central object of sort of national memory culture and public memorialization in Turkey today. I mean, there are many competitors for this. But the museum and the site consist of this monument, which there's a lot to be said about that in its own right, but the museum for me is more fascinating. On the top floor, you have a sort of recounting of the events of the night. You have video footage, you have relics of the violence, which have become a sort of, in some ways, even cliche of these sorts of museums. And then you have a long video that basically provides the dominant narrative in Turkey nowadays about the coup, which clearly attaches blame to the Fethullah Gülen group. I'm not going to get into the sort of difficulty of evaluating that claim here. Ivan is telling me I've already run out of my 5 minutes, apparently, which is extraordinary. But then the museum moves to this much broader, much more capacious exhibition and argument that essentially coups, and in particular this coup attempt, are part of a broader sort of global imperialist attempt to orchestrate politics everywhere, and this also includes colonialism, includes the North Atlantic slave trade, it includes everything bad under the sun, basically. And so it is this quite Manichaean image of political history in which you have the heroes and the villains, and this was an instance in which the villains tried to overthrow the heroes, they've failed, and here we have a museum to tell us about it. Andy, please. We'll have 10 minutes for the break. I can't resist hearing from you.
Thanks, Jeremy, for these really wonderful opening remarks. I'm sure we'll be returning to them throughout the next 3 days. My question is about, I guess, de-imperiality and decoloniality, and the way that the very formation of the concepts seems to imply some kind of subtraction, right? To decolonize would be to remove something, to de-imperialize, to remove something. And this is just based on kind of a semantic interpretation of the concepts. But obviously with both decoloniality and from what I'm hearing from you this morning on de-imperiality, the concepts can never be about subtraction or erasure, but they are about producing something new, right? So it's to decolonize is actually to produce something that creates a new reality that's not devoid of coloniality and or utterly like extracting like surgically coloniality, but producing a new type of terrain where coloniality is problematized. And similarly, I hear you saying with de-imperiality, it's about creating a new kind of reality, a new production in which imperiality is problematized. But I just wanted to hear more about how you envision the kind of I don't know, knowledge formations or even the kind of politics that is produced through de-imperial critique, where it's not about subtraction, it's about making something new.
Thank you, Andy. That is the 64,000 euro question, I think. So we're going to have to probably postpone a longer conversation of it. I'm doing this typical technique. Now I'm going to rely on the fact that time is up. But no, two very quick responses that will be insufficient. First, I think, and there are others, of course, who work in decolonial thought more directly than I do, who I think are more capable of addressing this, but I am quite curious about the relationship between decolonization, as it first was sort of understood as a political movement in the aftermath of World War II, and decoloniality, which doesn't come about as a concept until somewhat later in the 90s and 2000s, right? And I think, thinking through the sort of explicit political transformations that decolonization involves versus the more sort of capacious transformation of sensibilities, subjectivities, and positionalities that decoloniality, as I understand it, involves, is worth further discussion. I don't know that I'm the person to do that, but I think that relationship is important. Secondly, as exactly as you say, it's not about subtracting or surgically excising something, but rather, in particular, I think, and again, I'm still working with this, I've recruited all of you to some extent to this project, whether you know it or not, but as I'm understanding it at the moment, a de-imperial critique or a de-imperial politics is precisely not about erasure, but about countering the erasures that are inherent in the ways in which these legacies of different empires, especially, I should say, also inter-imperial, post-imperial contexts, because that really is the core of what we're doing, where these former, I mean, almost all post-imperial contexts are also inter-imperial contexts in different ways, thinking about the work of Laura Doyle now especially. But countering that erasure and that sort of negative movement with actually something that is able to, and again, this is, I think, the most difficult and perhaps the most controversial or at least most dubious proposition, trying to dwell in the uncanniness, what I understand the uncanniness of these spaces to be. So I'm repeating myself there, but hopefully that'll be sufficient for the moment. We should have coffee, and we have Madina Tolstanova awaiting us in a moment. But thank you all again, and welcome once more.